Hey, welcome to your now weekly WatchCats news roundup. We decided daily was a little bit of overkill. We are in future going to be doing a little lower frequency, but try and get both of us on together to really focus on the major news stories over the past week or so and give you an update on those. So I'm here with Noah Kunin. Welcome back,
everybody.
Noah.
Good to be back.
We got quite a pile of stories since the last update. First off, there's a cluster of stories really from primarily from Wired and the Washington Post concerning DOGE's consolidation of different government databases, and in particular, the use of those databases to track and target immigrants. Wired has a big picture story titled "DOGE is building a master database to surveil and track immigrants." And it's actually a really good sort of 30,000 foot picture of how DOGE is, as I say, knitting together immigration databases across DHS and uploading data from outside agencies, including the Social Security Administration, as well as voting records. And the idea here is a system that can be used to identify and monitor immigrants. And so they've not only had access to an existing customs and immigration data lake, which is what they call their kind of massive pools of data, but have been uploading to it data from the IRS, the Social Security Administration, and voting data from at least Pennsylvania and Florida. And it looks as though they are rapidly expanding the pool of databases they have access to. Wired notes they've gained access to sensitive data sets from the Department of Labor on immigrants and farm workers, and this is primarily people who are legally authorized to work in the U.S., non-citizens who have some kind of authorized status to be working in the United States. While the Justice Department has also granted DOGE access, according to the Washington Post, to a system called ECAS. This is their immigration case system, including a ton of sensitive data about migrants in the U.S., including, for example, confidential interviews from asylum seekers, which in many cases is the kind of information that could put someone's lives at risk. It's, testimony from interviews about why they're fear for their lives, why they may, for example, be on the wrong side of a foreign government or drug cartels or gangs. And again, normally these are data sets that are limited only to lawyers and investigators within DHS. So for them to have this kind of access is pretty unusual. The Washington Post also explains that they've had access to data from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and that they seem to be particularly focused on what HUD calls mixed status households. That is, a single household where you have different immigration status. So you may have a parent or grandparent who is undocumented living with children and grandchildren who are citizens, or one spouse who is a citizen and another spouse who is undocumented. And the idea here appears to be to essentially shut off benefits to the entire household if anyone in that household is undocumented, even if the citizen members of the household are eligible to receive benefits. So that's one of the ends to which this kind of pooling of data is being put. That is, you aggregate data from across these different agencies. If you find someone who appears to be undocumented, I say appears to be, it's important here because these are a lot of different data sets that structure and store data in a lot of different ways. The risk of false positives seems fairly high. And then to ensure that no one in that household, including the citizens, is receiving benefits. They also appear to be accessing, the same Washington Post article tells us, education department data sets, and the Post notes a essay that former American Enterprise Institute scholar Max Eden, who is now a White House official, laid out, suggesting that the Department's Civil Rights Office, the Department of Education's Civil Rights Office, could find the identity of every single foreign student who supported protests against Israel's bombing of Gaza, and revoke all of their student visas, or, as we've seen in other prominent cases, perhaps even revoke green cards of people who have achieved legal status. And I think this is a slew of stories that I think speak to the way DOGE is functioning, not just as a identifier of waste and fraud, but as a data consolidator in service of other elements of the administration's policy agenda, including a heavy crackdown on immigration. And what I think may be most disturbing is a kind of selective crackdown, including on people who are here legally, being targeted for essentially having political views and expressing political views of which the administration disapproves. And again, collecting all this data across all these sources makes it a lot easier to identify, hey, who are the people who are here on student visas, and also, maybe participating in some way or supporting political causes the administration finds disfavorable. I will note there may be an escape, however. The Musk team is also building a system to sell gold card immigrant visas. This is a version of something the United States already does. If you invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in the U.S. economy, you can get a kind of expedited approval for a green card and eventually citizenship. Trump seems to want to just rebrand that and raise the cost of it, and essentially say, well, if you pay X million dollars, you can get a fast track to citizenship. One more story worth mentioning in this sort of broad pool of DOGE consolidating access to different data systems is that there's a whistleblower at the National Labor Relations Board who has a series of pretty disturbing allegations of how DOGE staff have been accessing that organization's sensitive databases, which include information about contract negotiations and unions that, of course, are heavily protected and would be of potential great value to, for example, employers that are trying to deal with unionization efforts or negotiating with unions, which include, of course, a lot of Elon Musk's friends. And what is particularly disturbing about this story is they really are effectively acting like you would expect, cyber criminals or hackers to ask. The whistleblower reported that members of the DOGE team asked that their activities not be logged on the system, and then appeared to try to cover their tracks behind them by turning off monitoring tools and manually deleting records of their access. This is, kind of basic Cybersecurity 101, which is you need auditable logs of activity on the system so you know if the system is being used improperly. And in fact, it appeared that not only were they trying to cover their activities on the system, but exfiltrating large amounts of data. And in fact, a lawyer for the whistleblower suggested that large amounts of data were being exfiltrated over a Starlink link to, or at least through, Russia. So there had logins that appear to come from outside the country, accessing and downloading information from this sensitive NLRB database. I think that's very much a story to watch. The whistleblower also suggested that he had received a physically threatening note after attempting to raise concerns about what the DOGE team at NLRB was doing. This is a note that apparently included sensitive personal information, including overhead photos of him walking his dog that appeared to have been taken with a drone. This is just a kind of surreal and disturbing story that I think it is very much worth keeping an eye on. How about you, Noah? What have you got for us?
Well, speaking first of this locus of issues around privacy and cybersecurity, for those especially interested in the privacy perspective, we have an interview coming up with the Electronic Privacy Information Center. We spoke to their senior director of litigation, where we get deep into how many of these intrusions into privacy or creating entirely out of whole cloth new risks to privacy are in fact statutory, are in fact legal, and how many of them are going to be challenged in court, and what's the probability of success for them. Now,
And
obviously,
one thing I think to add on that front that I probably should have stressed when I was going through the stories is, we've talked, I think, in the past about the reasons these databases are typically siloed, right? There's the sort of ordinary cybersecurity reasons of a unified database is a more attractive target to hack.
Yes.
And therefore worth investing a lot more resources in compromising, which raises the risk of breach. It also is more susceptible to internal abuse for inappropriate purposes. But also, there's a kind of important incentive issue, which is we want people to kind of cooperate in providing the government with accurate information that it needs to make decisions. And one of the ways we do that is by trying to assure people that data provided for one purpose will not, except in extraordinary circumstances, be used against them for a different purpose. So that if you are, appropriately filing your taxes and providing accurate tax information, this will not normally be fed to immigration enforcement to go after you for overstaying your visa. If you are, providing accurate tax information about the political causes you have given money to, this is not going to be used to revoke your student visa because the administration doesn't like that you are, supporting causes that are, for example, critical of Israel, and effectively. This kind of consolidation just very much flies in the face of that goal. You're I think, going to start seeing, as a result of this, people being a lot more cautious about what information they're providing to the government and the quality of the information available to the government to base decisions on declining as a result.
There is, and I think always will be, a natural tension between privacy and security, whether cyber or otherwise, and not even necessarily in the way our audience might be imagining it. The baseline tension, I think, is pretty obvious, right? You can imagine a regime in which there are fewer rights to privacy, but that information is being used to guarantee security to society and individuals. That's the sort of nascent baseline tension. But then there's a secondary tension on top of that, which is often in order to preserve privacy, right, from adversarial forces, you need to monitor systems, right, to such a high degree in order to provide that security to them, right? So you're essentially shifting access into certain trusted venues to make sure other individuals, groups, adversaries, nation states don't get access to that information. At the heart of the security component of digital security, which the government formalizes as understanding the confidentiality of a system. The US government, when it analyzes its own digital systems, when it analyzes the digital systems of its contractors and partners, there are three attributes it's always looking about and thinking about and considering if a single change or a bug or an exploit is impacting those three things. Those three things are integrity, availability, and confidentiality. And I'll focus on the confidentiality part because that's obviously one of the key components for privacy. And at the center of that has been a database that the US government has paid a contractor, MITRE, to maintain for over 25 years. And that is the Common Vulnerability and Exposures Program, otherwise known as CVE. And as a former programmer, as a leader of technology programs in the government and elsewhere, I cannot emphasize strongly enough to our audience how important this program is. What we learned is CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is within the Department of Homeland Security, took over the requirement for this contract when it was formed, right? So previously it had been with Homeland Security writ large. And they waited until the last second to refund and extend that program. It almost lapsed the other day. And again, the consequence of this would be massive. The CVE service and database and data feed really is not just somewhere you go if you're a programmer. It's not like a book or a bulletin that you read, like, I'm going to read this information and then I'm going to write a secure computer program. The CVE is an ongoing feed of every vulnerability and exposure to every major and minor computer system in operation on the face of the earth. This might sound surprising. The US was able to control and maintain and operate the foundational component to computer security for the entire earth for multiple decades, but it is true. These data feeds don't just go to human beings like you get an alert, well, back in the day on your pager, on your phone, right, or in your email, but rather there are automated systems of monitoring and protection that ingest this information. There are automated systems that every time you update a computer program, another computer program scans your code base, identifying where you might have created a known vulnerability and exposure. Not just a 0 day, not just like, oh, this is day 0 of knowing about this key vulnerability, but all historical vulnerabilities and exposures that may be relevant to the languages and tools you use to create that computer program. It scans it, notifies the developer, the software engineer, oh, wow, I've created a couple yellow, a couple orange, and a couple like hair on fire vulnerabilities. I need to fix those before I push that change live. All of those systems, all of them, there is not an alternative. There's not a marketplace of data. There is one system that generates that information, and that is the CVE system. And because of dysfunction and flat out stupidity, I guess, they almost let this program lapse. And part of the board that oversees the CVE program indicated that as of recently, as a few days ago, April 15th, the government said they were not going to renew the contract for managing that program. And then they quickly turned it around and have now extended it in an emergency provision for 11 months. This has spurred a portion of the board, it's effectively a nonprofit that the government causes to come into existence and pays the funding of, to say, you know what, we've been thinking for a while, maybe the US government should not wholly own this system, and we should not be 100% dependent on the US government to maintain it. Maybe we should have a more diverse set of funding and leadership. And so they have declared that they want to move in that direction. We'll see if that actually happens. But this is just another example of whether or not you think it is right for the US government to control this critical piece of infrastructure. It is one of the, we talked about this in one of our first interviews, right? The soft power over infrastructural systems. Yeah. It is just another block in the wall of what has maintained US hegemony in all kinds of domains.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like, frankly, the kind of thing that I might prefer, that something this important were, you know, sort of fully independent of any particular government. But I can also imagine from a sort of national security and as you say, soft power perspective, why it might be greatly advantageous to the government to maintain it. And certainly, if nothing else, it seems insane to me that we came within, 48 hours of funding for this lapsing, apparently without people realizing what was going on or how important it was. I mean, it's one thing to say we're going to make a calculated choice to transition this to some kind of different stewardship, but the idea that it might just stop working is terrifying.
Yeah, and it's obvious because of what happened. It's not as if the U.S. government, because you could kind of imagine this as like they're like a Trump or DOGE position. It's like, oh yeah, now we're going to stick it to these people, right, and tell them, hey, you can't in fact use this anymore as an independent source, and we're going to start gating it. That would be incredibly destructive, but at least it would be like intentional evil. This was like a massive own goal.
And At the same time, it sounds like a lot of the cybersecurity expertise within the government is heading for the door. What do you know about that?
Absolutely. All this is officials who led the Secure by Design initiative. Talking about what the Secure by Design initiative means is way out of the scope of one of our weekly roundups. Maybe we'll interview one of these people in the near future. That would not be surprising to me. But the TLDR of this is like, hey, what if there were ways to write software that was more secure by default, right? Secure by design, secure by default is more resistant to discovering some unexpected exposure or vulnerability. There actually are ways to do this, both from a methodology point of view and also like a mathematical point of view, right? There are ways to create systems which can prove that they are in fact secure, can actually prove their confidentiality, integrity. Availability is a little more complicated. But so this is a very important initiative to be like, hey, how can we get out ahead of this? How can we build houses that don't spontaneously combust versus investing in firefighters, right? And the key senior officials behind that program have resigned. Their statements were very political, which I can understand. But again, if you were even remotely serious about this kind of work, these are the people that you would have made sure stay within CISA at all possible cost. So those pillars are out. It is very likely that program is dead. Again, one of our early interviews, right? Indicating that likely all of the progress we've made around information security and combating hackers and criminals made not just during Biden or Obama, but made during the first Trump administration.
Yeah.
Especially, in fact, one of the few credits, right, I and others would give them is all of that is being rolled back. Another great example of that is the entire Defense Digital Service, which is the arm of the classic, the pre-DOGE version of the U.S. Digital Service that existed in the Pentagon and the Department of Defense, have resigned en masse. Little more direct statement there, which I really appreciate. Essentially, their head said, look, we either all resign now or we're going to be made ineffective and useless within a few months, so we might as well do it and indicate that we are being sidelined and have no ability to make improvements anymore.
And this is, I think, again, if you look back over previous sort of news roundups we've done, there is a real pattern here, which is you've got DOGE very rapidly restructuring government IT systems with a relatively small team of, frankly, not very experienced young people. At the same time, the sort of cybersecurity and IT expertise elsewhere in the government is really being kind of systematically hollowed out, which is, to me, pretty disturbing because it's, you're saying effectively, look, all the other folks who would be in a position to maybe notice and correct if these teams of kids are doing something dangerous or wrong, are either being fired or, essentially faced with such sort of demoralizing working conditions that they see the writing on the wall and say, okay, and resign voluntarily. That does not strike me as a particularly safe situation from either a cybersecurity perspective or frankly, a kind of democratic accountability perspective, right? The more these folks are out the door, the less likely you are to have, as we mentioned earlier, right, a whistleblower who notices, hey, these guys are exfiltrating huge amounts of sensitive data from a protected data set for God knows what reason and to who knows what destination, and kind of running roughshod over all the sort of normal best practices we use to protect this data in the process, right? You need technically competent people to notice when stuff like that is happening, and increasingly those people are out the door.
And look, I know this is a news roundup, but let's zoom out just for a second as we conclude here. You can see this as an outgrowth of the anti-establishment, anti-expert, anti-elite vibe, right, that has been in the country for a minute. The extension of which to people who themselves consider themselves experts, looking at the government and deciding, hey, the government is bad at X. Therefore, the people who worked on X are incompetent. I'm a smart person. I'll just need to get rid of them and I'll be able to do X really well, right? The problem, the fallacy with that logical chain is, what if X is a problem that is actually 10 to 100 times harder than what you consider yourself an expert at? Like, I'm sorry, if you are at Twitter, now X, and your major job was having people post text and make sure number go up when you hit likes, that is not a particularly hard technical problem. It's work, especially at scale. It's a lot of work. But all too often I see people confuse the scale of work with actually intellectually challenging problems that do not have an obvious solution. And let me tell you, trying to protect the largest organization, second largest organization in the world, probably behind the army of the CCP, the second largest organizations of the world's information systems, is not a simple problem to solve.
Finally, we've tried to talk about a couple of broad areas of news stories in depth. I want to close by just giving you a very quick read through of sort of headlines of other stories that crossed our radar. We don't have time to get into in detail, but on WatchCats.show, we have links to all of these that you can check out if you want the full story. First, from the Washington Post, the 5 things emails are going by the wayside as Musk readies his exit. That's the famous email that was sent out essentially by DOGE, demanding that everyone give 5 bullet points of what they did every week to sort of justify their continued employment. Apparently, a lot of agency heads are effectively pushing back on that, saying you don't need to comply with this. I think the idea here is people are seeing Musk, reaching the end of his tenure or probable tenure, and essentially sort of sick of being bossed around at the agencies they run. So a sign of an internal tension that's been simmering for a while there. Via my old friend Dara Lind at Immigration Impact, seemingly, again, as part of DOGE's efforts to take part in the administration's immigration agenda, mass emails have been going out telling people it's time for them to leave the United States within 7 days. But many people have been receiving these in error, including people who have ongoing immigration proceedings. And in several cases, U.S. citizens have been told effectively that the immigration services are ordering them to self-deport from the country. We know the Trump administration is planning to end the IRS direct file program for free tax filing. This is, again, the kind of thing that if you care about government efficiency, you might think would make a lot of sense. The major tax preparation companies.
All you need to, sorry to jump in, Julian. All you need to know about this story is every single company whose entire or large part of their business model is about charging you to actually comply with the law is against this, should tell you everything you need to know.
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of, when you think about it, it's a slightly crazy setup. I mean, if you have very complicated finances, of course, there are good reasons to have an external professional looking at these things. But really, there's no other case where if you need to apply for some kind of government permit or a passport, whatever it is, where instead of just filing that application or submitting that information on a government website, you are supposed to go pay some third party to submit the application for you. Of course, the services that take your money to do that like that a whole lot, but it's not necessarily any more efficient than just having the government able to receive that information, at least in the cases where your finances are not such that you really require some kind of professional accountant reviewing them before they're submitted. But that is being cut from IRS at the same time. The head of the IRS was ousted amid a power struggle within Scott Bessent. Sorry, hang on. Let me actually.
The reason why Julian will take a second here is I think we're now on our second or third acting head of the IRS. It's hard to keep track.
Sorry. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent had complained to President Trump that Elon Musk had installed an IRS acting head without his knowledge. I guess this goes in the sort of bucket of agencies getting kind of fed up with Elon Musk taking authority into his own hands. But so lots of strangeness at IRS as again apparently Elon Musk took it upon himself to install a head of the agency. Another story via Wired is that the ACLU is suing the government for access to DOGE records. DOGE likes to talk a big game about how unprecedentedly transparent they are, but the reality is a lot of their activities are again, essentially reliant on internal whistleblowers to get disseminated to the public. Speaking of, I think there's actually a long, interesting article at ProPublica about the administration's war on measurement, to use their phrase. So essentially, the administration is cutting efforts to compile and analyze data on things like drug use, the effects of climate change, maternal mortality. In a way, I think this is kind of a callback to the first Trump administration, where then Donald Trump complained that we were doing too much testing for COVID, and if we weren't testing so much, we wouldn't have all these terrible headlines about how the numbers keep going up. This seems, fairly important, in part because, again, if you are interested in government efficiency, you need to measure what the effects of your policies are and measure where resources need to be devoted. You cannot know whether the way you're using your resources is efficient unless you know what is the scale of the problem that you're trying to tackle, and are current efforts making that problem bigger or smaller. So another kind of longish article, I think, there that is worthwhile because it really covers cuts across an array of different agencies that are essentially shutting down programs that were previously providing publicly available information about a whole range of issues. Via my friend Kristen Capps at Bloomberg, DOGE has apparently visited the National Gallery of Art to discuss the museum's legal status. This is an interesting case because there's a series of these sort of quasi-independent agencies that DOGE has essentially tried to assert some kind of authority over. The National Gallery is not part of the Smithsonian sort of complex of museums and cultural institutions, but a kind of quasi-government supported, but primarily drawing its funds from an independent trust. So there's some questions there. Well, how, to what extent does it make sense for DOGE to be dictating to them that they need to make cuts or become more efficient? But that is apparently underway. And I think that story makes a good pairing with a story at The Unpopulist, tracking in some greater detail a story we've mentioned here before about DOGE thugs basically taking over the U.S. Institute of Peace, which again was a kind of quasi-independent agency established by Congress, but technically not part of the federal government. Again, the kind of DOGE mandate to make government more efficient seems to be extending to a range of entities that are not in the normal sense part of the government. Finally, another thing we've covered in past roundups is some dubious claims about fraud, whether it's 150-year-olds supposedly collecting Social Security, they weren't, or people non-citizens supposedly turning up on voter rolls. Probably those are mismatches given the dubious methodology they used. The Guardian also has a follow-up on a story by the New York Times' Emily Badger regarding, again, supposedly bogus people collecting public benefits. Again, essentially confirming Emily's reporting that these are old news. This is fraud that was uncovered during the Biden administration. They are now sort of rediscovering and thinking they found some new evidence when, in fact, these are records that were deliberately left in the system for the purpose of monitoring fraudulent activity without tying it to people whose identity, for example, might have been compromised. Also, DOGE has placed the entire staff of a federal agency dedicated to combating homelessness on leave. So this is another for our, I guess, long series of entities on the chopping block. Well, so that is a long list of stories that we're not going to discuss in great detail, but you can find links to below. Noah, any final thoughts?
I think my only comment is going to be right now that, like, I don't think, and no one should think, Elon Musk leaving Doge is the end of the story. Yeah. I don't think the dissolution of Doge is the true end of the story. If anything, it might get more interesting and more requiring of multiple eyes and ears chasing down leads. My general feeling about all of this is the most even if you don't assume charitable intent, this is the most incompetent way to have gone about this. It might be that Elon himself is the biggest impediment to doing this competently. So just want to remind our audience that no matter what happens in the coming weeks regarding the big man with the big social account and the big rockets, whether or not he's involved, the story continues.
Well, thanks again then for joining us. Please stay tuned and check out our upcoming podcast proper episode featuring John Davison of the Electronic Privacy Information Center. And remember, at WatchCats.org, you can become a subscriber to WatchCats and potentially join our community Discord. Until next time, I am Julian Sanchez.
I think it's WatchCats.com.
WatchCats.show?
WatchCats.show. We got it.
WatchCats.show.
Literally, the number of news stories this week literally melted our brains.
So we'll see you at WatchCats.show. Until next time. Cheers.
Take it easy. Bye.